let's look at some arguments lobbyists and special interest groups use to restrict trade. So when it comes to restriction of trade, most of the time we're going to restrict imports. As we've said, it's a wide belief that imports are somehow bad for our economy because imports create some job losses without realizing that imports actually benefit our consumers. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the arguments for restricting trade, and we're going to try to come up with a counter argument that is actually going to be pro free trade. So first most common used argument is the jobs argument that says that trade, specifically imports, destroys jobs in industries that compete with imports. So trade is not good for our economy because some jobs are lost since the factory is moved to the other country. So how can we respond to that? We need to respond with something that actually shows the positives of imports. Okay, yes, it's a valid argument. Some jobs are going to be lost, but we can compensate it by creating more jobs in export industries. We have to remember that we need to have this balance between imports and exports. Instead of concentrating on producing everything, we said it's good for us to specialize and produce certain things in which we are better than everybody else. And we have a lot of export industries. So when we export goods and services, we create additional jobs. So we can compensate the jobs lost in the import sections by creating jobs in export industries. So instead of keeping those industries in which we don't have comparative advantage, we better concentrate on those where we are better than the rest of the world. Also, we have to remember that consumers are paying much lower prices than they would without trade. Yes, overall, it's harder to realize when somebody loses a job, how can we compensate for it? But as economists, we look at overall pictures, and overall consumers benefit from imports much more than lose from it due to the lost jobs. The second argument is the national security argument. That says that preventing dependence on imports that could be disrupted during wartime. What it says is that we need to produce certain goods and services in United States and not allow other countries to produce them or at least restrict production because during the wartime we can't be dependent on those industries. How do economists respond? Yes, once again, it's a valid argument, but we need to make sure that that industry is really essential for us during the wartime. Remember in your book there was an example of mohair farmers that were protected by law, that were receiving high subsidies, a lot of subsidies, and not were able to compete with the rest of the world. Well, actually, we were subsidizing them. We were not allowing other farmers to compete with ours because we thought that that was essential for creating the wardrobe for the military in the case of war. But that industry is no longer essential for us to survive. We really have to make sure that yes, if we are protecting that industry, then it really must be essential. If we're simply going to start restricting imports in the areas where not related to our survival or not going to support our military or not going to support our nation, then maybe we are overstating this argument and maybe we're just using it to get more profit and not really help out our economy and not really help out our country in a case of war. Infant industry argument. A new industry argues for temporary protection until it is mature and can compete with foreign firms. Like somebody creates a new company and says, you know what, in a couple of years I'll be profitable, but please protect me for at least a couple of years until I grow and until I'm able to compete with those other foreign countries. Well, how can we respond to that? First of all, there's no guarantee that that industry will thrive in the future. So how do we know if we're supporting something that in the future is really going to mature and become profitable? If it's not going to become profitable, we're pretty much wasting our money and time. If it will be, then they should be willing to incur some losses in the present in order to be profitable in the future. That's what private markets do, right? You are right now incurring some losses by going to school with the purpose of being more profitable in the future when you get a better job. So why are you willing to take this risk and some private companies not? Why do some of those private companies want protection at the cost of our consumers? Unfair competition argument. Producers argue that their competitors in another country have unfair advantage due to the government subsidies. For example, our farmers may say that, well, Mexican farmers receive a lot of subsidies. For that reason, they're able to produce avocados or sell avocados at much lower prices than we can. So protect us. Restrict the trade with Mexico. Restrict the imports of avocados so we are able to sell ours at the higher prices. Well, how can we respond? Actually, it doesn't get better than that. We consumers are enjoying lower prices and foreign countries are paying for it. If foreign government subsidizes their producers, it means that foreign government pays in order for us to receive lower prices. It really doesn't get better than that. Yes, once again, our producers may suffer, but we consumers receive a lot of benefit and we're not paying for it with our higher taxes. Finally, protection as a bargaining chip argument. For example, US can threaten to limit imports on French wine unless France lifts their quotas on American beef. So we can use this protection as bargain chip. Well, let's look at the response. If France refuses to actually bargain with us, we are hurting our consumers. If we're really going to put the limit imports on French wine or any other goods, you don't have to necessarily think about wine, then we are hurting our consumers once again. Simply because we're not happy with French policies, we're going to end up hurting our own consumers. And if we decide not to punish them, we lose credibility. If we decide that, okay, well, they didn't go for it, so let's not put the limits on imports, then we're losing our credibility, which is also not good for our country. So those are the arguments that used for restricting trade. Remember, like with anything else, there is always costs and benefits. Most economists believe that trade is good for our economy, that free trade is better than restricted trade. We may restrict trade for some reasons, but we always have to remember that we may hurt our economy more with restricting trade than actually helping it. Last thing for this lecture is a discussion of fair trade. So fair trade is something different from free trade. Fair trade is a social movement to ensure that producers or exports in developing nations receive fair price for their product, have safe, healthy working conditions, and use environmentally sustainable practices. So all of this tells us that we want to make sure that those foreign producers receive adequate prices. A lot of times you see this on coffee, fair trade coffee, and usually that coffee is much more expensive than any other coffee, because we're trying to say that, well, whatever the other price is not really high enough. We're not paying high enough price to the producers. They're quotation marks slaving for those plantations so we can receive lower prices. And we need to pay them more so their workers receive adequate pay. We also a lot of times concerned about children working on some factories and producing working at the sweatshops, right? That's what we call sweatshops, where children or women work in the maybe not very safe, not very healthy working conditions. And a lot of times we say that developing nations are not necessarily using sustainable practices, environmentally sustainable practices, so we are willing to pay higher prices for them to take better care of the environment. Like with everything else, let's look at the defendants and look at the opposition to the fair trade. Let's start with the proponents. The proponents of fair trade support the theory and principles of free trade. They claim that in many cases there are market failures which prevent the benefits of free trade from working. So in the way they say that free trade is not going to result in the efficient market. For example, they say that rural farmers don't have good information. They don't have access to the good information. As a result, asymmetric information problem exists, and they don't know what price they can actually charge for their goods. They also say that rural farmers are at the mercy of the middlemen. So a lot of times middlemen are paying very low price to those farmers, and they're receiving very high price from the end consumer. And rural farmers don't have access to credit. As a result, they're very much dependent on those middlemen or maybe some other people to adequately price their goods and services. So what they argue for is that there should be a government-mandated minimum price for some agricultural goods in order to ensure that those farmers receive a fair payment for their product. The critics of fair trade usually recognize that idea of fair trade is based on the best intentions, but they say may not result in those intentions. They argue that this price restrictions, or what we call them price floors, the minimum price that we want to pay, causes market distortions. With higher prices, it encourages more production, and more production can lead to excess supply. So it can result in more things being produced than actually demanded by the market. As a result, excess supply will lead to downward pressure on price in the non-fair trade market. So as a result, we may hurt even more those producers that are not participating in the non-fair trade market. Finally, they would argue that fair trade is not a long-term solution. Like with anything else that artificially supports the market, it's not going to work probably in a long term. So we have to look more for the market solutions to problems of the fair trade.